Hello and welcome to the Murder Media podcast, where we analyse and overthink true crime content. I'm your host, Dr. Stella Marie Gaynor. Do follow the Murder Media Project over on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter at murdermedia81, that's the numbers 81, or email me directly at murdermedia81@gmail.com, where you can find all episodes linked via the WordPress site and Podbean. How is everybody? I hope everyone is well. I'm okay. I'm recording this, as I record this, I'm recording them in advance. As I record this, I'm not long back from Download Festival. I only went for a day. It was great, but it's taken a few days for my voice to come back from all the screaming and all the shouting that I did, so I do apologise if I end up sounding a little bit Dot Cotton at points during this. There was a lot of shouting, but it was good and wet. In this episode, we're going to take a long, hard look at Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy Tapes. Directed by Joe Berlinger and released on Netflix in 2019, this 4-part documentary retells the story of Bundy's crimes using tape recordings of conversations he had with Stephen Michaud whilst Bundy was sat on death row. I think he's pronounced it Michaud. That's what I'm going to go with. So, extremely successful journalist Stephen Michaud, if you are listening, I can only apologise if I'm getting your name wrong. Michaud met with Bundy in 1980, who'd been incarcerated for about a year. I say about a year. This is when they managed to actually keep him incarcerated after Bundy's 2 previous escapes. Bundy stood trial for the attempted kidnapping of Carol DeRonch and then the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, 2 college girls from Florida State University. He later stood trial for the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. He was found guilty on all counts and was given the death sentence. I think he was actually given 2 death sentences, was he? For the Chi Omega trial and for Leach trial? Anyway. Rotting away on death row, Bundy wanted to talk to a journalist to tell his side of the story, and it was Michaud and his colleague Hugh Ainsworth who took the job. Now, as far as Michaud and Ainsworth were concerned, this would be an explosive story whichever way it went. You know, they were journalists. Journalists want the big story. So if Bundy admitted everything, that's a mega story, because Bundy had denied everything and pled not guilty throughout. So if he admits everything, fantastic, they've got a, mega story. But if Bundy was able to explain and somehow prove that he didn't do it, unlikely, but again, it's a mega story. So they took the job, and it appeared that Bundy just wanted to tell his life story, or the idealised bullshit version anyway, with designs on his version becoming a book. Now, Michaud needed a way to get Bundy to talk about the crimes that he'd been found guilty of. So for the first, can't remember, the first, couple of sessions, Bundy just seems to want to tell this, frankly, like I said, bullshit story of his, his early childhood and how he had lots of friends and a lovely family, which, we do find out is all nonsense. And Bundy won't talk about the crimes. So when Michaud is asking him about, this crime scene or that murder, and Bundy's saying, I wouldn't know anything about that. I don't want to talk about that. So Michaud needs to get him to talk about these crimes. So he plays on Bundy's egotistical nature, the Bundy who thinks he's a genius, and, he's not. So if Bundy won't comment personally on the crimes, then perhaps, suggests Michaud, because you're oh so smart, Mr. Bundy, perhaps you could speculate on what the perpetrator might have done, how he might have done it. And Michaud convinces Bundy to talk about the crimes in the third person. And Bundy, the absolute melt, falls for this. Oh, they want me, the failed psychology major, to profile this killer? So they get Bundy talking, and it's all recorded, given us the Ted Bundy tapes. These tapes are brought together and edited to chronologically tell us the story, alongside talking head interviews with the other players, so various members of law enforcement, lawyers, etc. Conversations with a Killer, I'll just call it Conversations from now on, that's quite a mouthful, is a documentary, a form that is perceived as some form of truth. Now, documentary, though, is more of a, more of a negotiation between the real and the representations of the real, so says Stella. Thomas Watson notes that documentary shapes reality after the fact. Now, it's been 35 years since Bundy was executed, 45 years-ish since his trials. Now, that's a lot of time. This temporal distance allows documentary filmmakers too, with their work, with their craft, to offer a kind of revisionist version, a re-narrativization of events. Patricia Aufderheide, in her brilliant 2007 book, Documentary Film, A Very Short Introduction, says that documentary is, and this is a quote, a movie about real life. They are not real life. They are windows onto real life. They are portraits of real life, using real life as their raw material, constructed by artists and technicians who make myriad decisions about what story to tell to whom and for what purpose. End quote. So we need to think about who is making a documentary and why they are making it. I really like examining why media texts are made, obviously, who makes them, the channels, the streaming services, and what impact the models and strategies of the channels or streaming services, what impact this has, doesn't matter, on the final media text. There was a flurry of Ted Bundy content around 2019, with 2 coming from Joe Berlinger, who made Conversations that we're talking about now, and he also made Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile, which is a movie about Bundy. It's supposed to be about Liz Kendall, but it's not. Anyway, we'll talk about that in another episode. So I'll get to that film in another episode. What Conversations leans into, and how I and other scholars and TV critics have read it anyway, is a nostalgia for a manufactured 1970s. Conversations has a clear setup of Ted Bundy as a duplicitous monster, a man who was able to wear a mask of normality, this mask that hides the real Ted, and that there were in fact, 2 Teds. So, oh God, what's her name? Anne Rule, who wrote The Stranger Beside Me, she herself talked about the idea of 2 Teds being almost like the only way that she could sort of wrap her head around what happened, because she sat in the basically like suicide helpline with Ted and sat and watched him save people's lives, talk people back off the ledge, as it were. And then, she's having to wrap her head around the fact that he did all these murders. So for Anne Rule, for sure, it was, she could only sort of see it and think about it and sort of square it, I suppose, with there being 2 Teds, the nice one and the monster one. So this point on Ted's mask, or this duplicitous nature, I'll explain in more detail at the end of this episode. But for now, let's hear the trailer for Conversations with the Killer, the Ted Bundy Tapes.
He didn't look like anybody's notion of somebody who would tear apart young girls.
My name is Ted Bundy. I've never spoken to anybody about this. I am looking for an opportunity to tell the story as best I can.
A person of this type chooses his victim for a reason. Possession, control, violence.
There was something unique about Ted's brain. He talked in terms of a voice in his head, and this voice would start saying things about women.
He had very blue eyes. When he really got going, his eyes went absolutely black.
Murder, leaving a person of this type hungry, unfulfilled, would also leave him with the obviously irrational belief that the next time he did it, he would be fulfilled. And the next time he did it, he would be fulfilled. Or the next time he did it, he would be fulfilled.
Theodore Bundy has escaped, suspected of dozens of sex killings in Washington State, Idaho, Utah, and Colorado.
I think things are going to work out. That's about all I can say.
Bundy is acting as his own lawyer. What is unusual to see is that many of the onlookers are women.
Are you a little scared when you look at him?
He just doesn't look like the type to kill somebody.
Serial killer Theodore Bundy has escaped once again.
One of the FBI's most wanted men.
He was charming, good-looking, smart. You sure you have the right guy?
I mean, I'm not an animal and I'm not crazy. I'm a split personality.
I mean, I'm just a normal individual.
As we explored last episode, true crime has seen an explosion. There's more media, so there's more true crime around. It's not that true crime is loved more or is more popular, I don't think. I think there's just more of it. There's just more media anyway, more content. Serial killer has a strong presence in all media, be it real or fictional versions. So real, like hearing Conversations, or fictional, like, say, like Hannibal Lecter, for instance. So scholars have long puzzled over why these people and their actions make so much entertainment. Philip Simpson suggests that the serial killer narrative suits the conventions of folklore. Simpson goes on to argue that serial killers have a legendary status developed by and in the technocratic era, primarily through television. Now, Simpson was writing here in 2003, so long before the Netflix era, Netflix and Amazon and the like. So with the increase of media content, there's been an increase in places to find these serial killer folkloric stories. Victoria Smith argued that the serial killer has entered fictional drama and become a conflation with the superhero, which she says is a sign of current American culture in its depiction of a reaction to a powerlessness in the face of a nameless, faceless terror. Now, Smith here is obviously discussing Dexter. I'm sure you probably thought that anyway, which was a long-running drama which had a serial killer who also worked for the police. He cleans up the streets and only kills those who deserve it. And in Dexter, he's the hero, or I guess anti-hero for this. Now, Dexter recently, I think it's quite recent, all of it landed on Netflix again. I say again, has it been on there before? I don't know. But all of Dexter is currently available on the UK Netflix. And I thought, great, I'll watch that again, because when I have watched most of it before, and I seem to remember quite enjoying it. So I stuck a couple of episodes of Dexter on, and I found myself quite uncomfortable. I don't know if that's because I've been doing research into true crime, I've thought about it a bit more, I don't know. But it just, I don't know. So there's been real killers, right, who also claimed that they were cleaning up the streets. So Peter Sutcliffe, for example, said that's why he was killing women, said he was ridding the streets of sex workers. They wouldn't use the phrase sex workers, would he? The same goes for Juan David Oritz, who only as recently as 2022 was convicted of murdering 4 women in 2018 for the same reasons. Put a guy on screen, cleaning up, and give him some witty dialogue and put him in cargo pants and a tight-sleeved Henley shirt and bosh, anti-hero. Anyway, we're not talking about Dexter. Sidetrack there, sorry. So how then, get back on track, how did Netflix come to this retelling of the Bundy story? What's in it for Netflix? Well, the short answer is subscriptions. Sure, yes, but why? What else? Well, Conversations doesn't give us any more information about Bundy. There are so many books and films and TV series about the case, and I mean so many. I think Bundy's one of the most mediated serial killers. Anyway, I'm sure you could go and find that out for yourself. Conversations brings no new evidence, and it barely touches upon the most loathsome aspects of Bundy's crimes, the rapes, the torture, the necrophilia. And I say torture there because on the day that Bundy abducted 2 women from Lake Sammamish Park, we now know that he made one of them watch him kill the other, which is, of course, utter torture. Instead, Conversations presents Bundy as an enigma, as a puzzle to be solved, or more disconcertingly, as a figure to be in awe of. Michaud has solved a bit of the Bundy puzzle, as we heard a minute ago, by tricking him into talking about the crimes in the third person. Michaud has got one over on the super smart super monster, and in one of the many talking head addresses in Conversations, Michaud is pretty chuffed about this. For Netflix, this retelling of a well-known story sits inside their model very well. The chief content officer of Netflix, Ted Sarandos, said, and this is a quote, "If somebody has a great take on something that is hugely familiar," end quote, then this content with repetition and cultural references, familiar characters and familiar monsters, then this serves the Netflix algorithm and strategy of recommendations. Ted Bundy is absolutely a familiar monster. The Netflix interface allows the viewer to skip the title sequence, which, I suppose, in theory could make the titles of Netflix content obsolete. However, in recent years, titles have seen a resurgence that have made some worthy of acknowledgement, like Stranger Things or True Detective. There are some title sequences on some Netflix things that I let run. I don't skip them because I enjoy the titles so much. A Conversations with a Killer features titles that both align the show with its general feeling of nostalgia for the 70s and, more harrowingly, aligns Bundy's words and Bundy's claim that pornography was to blame for his crimes. Creator of the titles for Conversations, Lisa Boland, stated that Bundy's, quote, warped sense of self inspired the idea of using a clear cassette tape as a lens through which we see, from his point of view, the real Ted, end quote. Now, the real Ted, as we see throughout Conversations, was arrogant, deluded, and entirely lacking in remorse. Now, I put screenshots of the titles on the Instagram post for this episode. You can also see the titles on YouTube if you don't have Netflix. The music on the Conversations titles and throughout the series feature synthesizer, brass and strings with timbres and reverb synonymous with 1970s and 1980s sounds. The titles open with the pressing of the record button on a tape deck in a close-up, with slow-paced synths mixed with the echoing of Bundy's words over sepia-tinted images of his past and images of a wholesome childhood. So we see Bundy photographed as a child with his mother. We see his yearbook photo. We see a print advertisement which features a wholesome 1950s nuclear family, the family that Bundy sort of advertised as being real when we knew that his family was much more complex and there was no sort of original nuclear family for Ted. His mother gave birth to him in a home for unwed mothers. He never knew his real father. Anyway, the next image on the conveyor belt of photos is a soft-core yet highly sexualised image of a model in a bikini. This is immediately followed with the faces of Denise Naslund and Georgianne Hawkins, two girls who were murdered by Ted. Next, we have more pornographic images of women, still with the slow, dreamy synth mixed with Bundy's words, before the tape counter clicks over from 74 to 75, the years when Bundy was most active, when he committed many of his crimes. The pace picks up, and images of Bundy, a skull, print headlines, and his VW bug move underneath the clear tape, in collage with more pornographic images of women. You can tell I'm getting mad. The image of Brenda Ball joins Naslund and Hawkins in a collection of images of Bundy's car, crowbar, maps where he killed, and more softcore images. So the construction of images made me incensed when I first saw it. I was so mad. And I remember I was watching it at home on my own, and there was no one to complain about this to. There's no one to tell this to, which is why I'm telling you now. The order of images running under the clear tape in this title sequence, this gentle look at Bundy's early years where it's all wholesome, and the pornographic image which is presented to us before the first image of a victim, puts Bundy's life in an order. So we've got family and wholesomeness, nice Bundy, and then, oh, he sees some porn, right then, best go out and murder some women. So that the image of the model appears first, followed immediately by pictures of two victims, and then as the titles progress, images of nearly naked models in collage with Bundy's car, weapons, news reports on the murders, and images of these poor dead women. It just adds support to Bundy's ridiculous and, quite frankly, insulting excuse that pornography was to blame. Conversations does little to honour the women who were murdered. Instead, the series and those in it who are recounting the story seem to be in awe of Bundy. They variously describe him as an enigma, a mystery, significant, creative. Sheriff Ken Kitsavis wears an expression of wonder as he suggests that Bundy might have killed in the triple figures. Kitsavis recalls when Bundy was arrested following the Chi Omega murders and when Bundy would not give his name. When his identity was revealed, Kitsavis says, "We knew that we had someone very special, someone very special that we were holding." Throughout the series, those directly involved, police, detectives, lawyers, etc., speak of Bundy like he's superhuman. And I think it was in a couple of places. It was both in a review of Conversations with a Killer in Variety, and it was on a special episode of Side Stories of the last podcast on the left. Again, I'm going to reference that a lot as well. Where they discuss Conversations with the Killer, and like in this review in Variety, where they both said that if Bundy himself saw this documentary, that he'd love it. He'd think it was a great portrayal. And it's, that just feels a bit off, doesn't it? Anyway, for the serial killer industry more broadly, Peter Vronsky identified the shift from serial killer as repellent monster to superhuman star from the vast media coverage of the Bundy trial. Now, Bundy's trial was the first to be televised. Now, when I say serial killer industry, I mean those that benefit from the growth of the fear of serial killers. Social control agents like the police or FBI having their powers extended, business interests around certain technologies, surveillance technology, for example, or technology around, evidence gathering, media interests, serial killers sell content, from print newspapers to the aforementioned Netflix subscriptions, so that we can all watch the next documentary, and the newly created experts in the field. Keith Suthill has a great article on the serial killer industry, which I'll link in the show notes. A key thread that runs through Conversations is Bundy the chameleon, this apparently uncanny way that Bundy could change his appearance, and this is illustrated by showing various photographs of him. Now, these photographs span like 20 years. If you take a photograph of me now to me 20 years ago, I'm going to look different too. A lot has happened. In the photographs of Bundy, sometimes he has short hair, sometimes he has long hair. Sometimes he's just been arrested after scrabbling around the mountains in Aspen after jumping out of the court building window. Sometimes he has facial hair. Sometimes he's had a shave. And sometimes wait for it, he parts his hair on the opposite side. Wow, what a master of disguise. What a genius. And all of this just feeds into the received narrative that Bundy was too wily, too smart, too, brilliant to be caught. If Bundy is placed in a position of superhuman, then the onus is not put on the ineptitude of the police, is not put on the problems exacerbated by state forces refusing to share information. The law enforcement are left unblemished, and yet when they do catch him, and they finally, on the third go, keep him in prison, they become the folk heroes to Bundy's folk devil. In Conversations, the failings of the police are not examined. Only Carol Durant, who famously escaped Bundy, questions, why can't they find this man? She seems to be the only one exacerbated by how long this manhunt is taking. Now, quick side note, there is another documentary, Falling for a Killer, directed by Trish Wood. It's over on Amazon Prime, or Amazon Prime Video, or Prime Video, whatever you want to call it. Now, this one does look at the faults, the mistakes, the cultural contexts. If you've not seen it and you've got Amazon, please go and have a look at it. In fact, your homework this week is to watch both Conversations and Falling for a Killer and just marvel at the difference. Now, we'll unpack Falling for a Killer in a future episode, next week maybe, when we examine murder media content that is told from the perspective of women. So far, what I've been yapping on about is an excerpt from my chapter titled Better the Devil You Know, Nostalgia for the Captured Killer in Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy Tapes. I need to work on shorter chapter titles. It's really long. It's only long, I realise it's long when I read it out. Anyway, and that chapter is in the edited collection Serial Killers in Contemporary Television, Familiar Monsters in a Post-9/11 Culture. The collection is edited by Brett Robinson and Christine Daigle, and I'll link it in the show notes. I went back to this chapter and my research on it because I'm currently writing the proposal for the Murder Media book. Once the proposal is done, I'll write 2 chapters and then I'll send it to a publisher. I'll cast some spells, I'll make some wishes, and hope that reviewer number 2 is nice. On the proposal, though, which is a massive document, I'm up to the stage where I'm researching and writing the outline for chapter 4. And this chapter will focus on true crime content on Netflix, as I think there's a lot to be said with the particular look at Netflix. Some of this lies in the initial aims of Netflix as they built their streaming on-demand brand. So for those of us in the UK, Netflix used to be a DVD by mail service before it was a streaming service and long before it started making its own content. Now, we had a similar thing here. It's called Love Film, if you remember. So it was about $5 a month to have an unwatched DVD, sit on a shelf, wait to be posted back. Anyway, Netflix, back in the mid to late 2000s, had designs to rival HBO. Now, I explore and present this in detail and at great length in my last book, Rethinking Horror, but it's the strategies of an early Netflix that help us to understand why it became what it is today. So I'll try and condense this. Netflix and many other channels and services in the late 2000s looked to the HBO model of subscription service, which gave them freedom from regulation. So there was lots of sex and violence and profanity in the content. It had a library of films shown on rotation, some adult content, and the subscription money from, getting HBO, this was funneled into a few pieces of quality content. And the term quality is a bit woolly, but you know what I mean. So that would be texturally rich dramas or super slick documentaries. So they've got this library of content that they show on rotation, and the money they get from subs they put into making, 1 or 2 really quality pieces a year. Now, HBO did also make some not so super slick documentaries, they still do, and it still makes, some quite trashy, salacious ones, as well as the ones that are more high profile, like, say, The Jinx. So as Netflix progressed, and they moved into streaming services, they moved into the service we know them to be as a subscription service, they looked at HBO, they began making original content, they took their subscriptions and funneled it into making more content, and Netflix sought to outmaneuver HBO in the arms race that was the early 2010s television. But Netflix worked by different conditions. Netflix works with data, lots and lots of data about each subscriber. Netflix creates a very personalised service. So my Netflix home screen looks different to yours because of what I click on, what I watch, and how long I watch it for. And that's different to you. Netflix aggregates data, and from that it makes a very fancy algorithm and decides what kind of programming would work for this or that pool of subscribers. Where does that put Conversations with a Killer then? Earlier I mentioned Chief Content Officer Ted Sarandos talking about if someone has a great take on something that is hugely familiar, then we're going to go with it. Then such content with repetition and cultural references, familiar characters and familiar monsters, this serves the Netflix algorithm and strategy of recommendations. Netflix suggests content to you that you will recognise, that is familiar to you. It will keep suggesting similar, familiar things to you. If you like that, you might like this. It's this familiarity and nostalgia that's key for understanding Conversations with a Killer. Now, at the time when Conversations came out, Netflix was doing very well with its peddling of nostalgia, tapping into a collective, imaginary past, something that was proving culturally valuable in very uncertain times. Netflix leaned into acquiring licenses for existing programming for rerunning on the service, from Friends to Riverdale to screen the TV series harking back to a carefree 90s, to of course Netflix originals leaning hard into nostalgia with its flagship series Stranger Things. Stranger Things is a sci-fi fantasy set in Reaganite America, a series that buckles under the weight of old Pepsi logos, D&D references and copious movie scores remembered from the millennial childhoods. It's just swimming in nostalgia. So the comfort of the familiar was proving popular, and it was working very well for Netflix. As I hinted at last episode, with the growth of other media platforms developing their own true crime content, podcasts in particular, Netflix began to develop its own true crime library of originals and acquisitions. Especially since 2018-2019, true crime documentaries have become one of the tentpoles of Netflix. Netflix said that true crime docs held the #1 position for the service on most of 2020 and 2021. And what were we doing in 2020 and 2021? We were in lockdown. So here then is a collision of Netflix strategies, true crime, nostalgia and familiarity. Into this, in 2019, lands Conversations with a Killer, which itself is soaking in nostalgia for a manufactured 70s. Rich in sepia tones, and it revels in the simplicity of a tale of bad guy being caught by good guys. And it is with these guys and the understanding of them that I want to introduce and discuss a frankly outstanding article that I read in the course of my research around Netflix and true crime as I was putting together my outline for the book chapter. The article is Duplicity and the Depraved Uncanny in Mediations of Ted Bundy by Bryann J. McCann from Women's Studies in Communication. Linked, of course, in the show notes, always linked. You ever read something and you want to grab the person next to you and tell them all about it, be it a family member or your partner or a stranger on the train, you want to tell them about it because it completely changes your thinking or it crystallises your thinking and you're super excited about it? Well, that happened with this article. It's absolutely going to be a key text in the Murder Media project. I'm bound to keep coming back to it. So McCann astutely and carefully explains how media texts about Bundy all present a fixation on, and this is a tough word, all present a fixation on the incommensurability between Bundy's nice guy image and his monstrous violence. McCann says that Bundy's gendered violence is the very same violence that underlies and underwrites the everyday performances of white masculinity. It is all, says McCann, predicated on a logic of violent possession. Bundy and other mediations of men like him, they have to show them as duplicitous. They are like these supervillains who wear a mask that allows them to perform, and this is a quote from McCann, to perform normative white Western masculinity by day and enact depraved violence by night. So I'm going to read a quote from the article, which is one, excellent anyway, and two, it crystallises why I was so incensed by that title sequence on Conversations with a Killer. So, to see Bundy's actions as a result of porn, which, quote, is itself a product of modern gender dynamics, has the potential to unravel alibis of gender normativity. Good-looking, smart, ambitious, the very things that sustain patriarchy are the very things that conceal the violence that underpins modern patriarchy and masculine hegemony, end quote. So this means then that mediations or tales of Bundy need to manage this so that the violence that underlies patriarchy and masculine hegemony is not exposed. Therefore, Bundy's texts concentrate on Bundy the duplicitous genius so that Western modernity can hide its dark and violent side. Porn didn't make Bundy a serial killer. Porn is just part of the same gendered violence spectrum on which both Bundy and hegemonic masculinity sit. If you make Bundy a one-off monster and the everyday patriarchal violence predicated on possession is both concealed and protected. So McCann is saying that texts about Bundy need to make him a mask-wearing, duplicitous supermonster so that it has no resonance with everyday white masculinity. The public, says McCann, transforms their serial killers into monsters who are anathema to, rather than product of, the social fabric. So at this point, I'm reading in the article, I want to start yelling at fellow passengers on the train. This is why serial killers are made monstrous, because if they're not, then we'll see them for what they are, which is just ordinary blokes. They have to be made other, anomalous. Now, just to think about another documentary, Falling for a Killer, for a second, Falling for a Killer does do some valuable cultural work in showing Bundy to be an ordinary guy and showing the context in which he was able to do what he did. But we're talking about Conversations. In Conversations, much work is done to split Bundy away from the, as McCann says, the gentleman, in order to preserve hegemonic masculinity. I'd love to just sit and read you the full article, like an audio book, but I can't. So I'll finish by expanding on this point about gentlemen from McCann, which echoes what I said about the authorities' reputations being left unblemished if Bundy's made out to be a genius. All the other men in Conversations, and there are lots of them in Conversation with a Killer, many of them talking in interviews, are positioned as gentlemen, real men, and real versions of modern masculinity. They catch the bad guy, they execute the bad guy, and they are the guys who turn up to the execution and cheer and wave placards, a good day out for all the family. The young men cheering, says McCann, also benefit from gendered violence, the system that bred Bundy. As the execution delivers a civic but violent correction, Conversations with a Killer affirms the gendered performance of others, the performance of the good guys and the performance of the bad guy, and those cheering the state-sanctioned violence of execution. Please do go and read McCann's article. It's got so much going on in it. It also explores the title sequence as well from Conversations. And McCann notes that the title sequence, it overlaps photographs of Bundy, creating that sort of double Ted, the monster and the everyman. It's really, really fascinating. All right, I think that's enough from me this week. Next week, let's continue with our exploration of Mediations of Bundy, and then we'll be done with him for a bit, I guess, until we get to Extremely Wicked. We'll have a look at Falling for a Killer. We'll also have a look at Bundy's story as told by a women-led podcast, and we'll look at what happens when this story collides with a very new and niche form of true crime, murder and makeup, over on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining me. Please do follow Murder Media on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter, all with the same handle, Murder Media 81, you know it by now. And all sources and media will be linked in the show notes. Share this podcast with anyone you reckon would be interested, and do tag, email or message me with any Murder Media stuff you'd like me to talk about, overthink and analyse, and let's carry on this conversation over on the socials. Goodbye.